Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that warm the heart and challenge the mind. Today's story is one of resilience, justice, and a fight against systemic inequality. It begins with a respected police chief visiting her hometown, but instead of a warm reception, she's met with racial profiling and abuse from a veteran officer. What happens next will shock you as we delve into an intense confrontation that sheds light on deeper issues within law enforcement. Stay with us as we dive into a powerful story about standing up to injustice, the courage to fight for what's right, and a twist that will leave you speechless. If you love stories filled with unexpected twists and powerful life-changing moments, be sure to comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an inspiring story from Hopeful Horizon. And let us know where you're listening from. It had been years since Chief Aniyah Blackstone returned to her hometown of Brookridge, a small but proud town nestled at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The last time she'd been there, she was fresh out of the academy, determined to make her mark in law enforcement. Now, after years of hard work, she had risen to the rank of police chief in a neighboring city, a position that garnered her respect and admiration from her peers. Aniyah wasn't returning for business, though. This visit was personal. Her father had fallen ill, and despite their sometimes strained relationship, she knew she needed to be there for him. Dressed in plain civilian clothes, jeans, a fitted jacket, and sneakers, Aniyah looked nothing like the officer she was. She wanted to blend in, be just another visitor in town. But as she soon learned, her appearance was all that mattered to some people. She parked her car outside the small corner store where she used to buy snacks as a kid. Stepping out, she smiled at the familiarity of it all, the weathered buildings, the old trees lining the street. But her moment of nostalgia was quickly interrupted. "Hey, you there!" A harsh voice boomed from behind her. Aniyah turned, her eyes narrowing at the sight of a burly, middle-aged white officer striding toward her. His face was stern, lips twisted in a sneer. The badge on his chest gleamed in the afternoon sun. Officer Wayne Cutter had been a fixture in Brookridge for years, notorious for his heavy-handed approach to law enforcement. But Aniyah had never expected to be on the receiving end of his aggression. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, keeping her voice neutral. She'd dealt with men like him before, men who saw her skin color as a threat, rather than her badge as a symbol of authority. Cutter stopped a few feet in front of her, looking her up and down with a judgmental glare. "What are you doing in this part of town?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Aniyah raised an eyebrow. "I'm just visiting." "Visiting, huh? This area's had some trouble lately. Gangs, drug dealers," Cutter said, his eyes narrowing. "You match the description of someone we've been looking for." Aniyah's stomach tightened. She knew exactly where this was going. "I'm not involved in anything illegal. I'm here for family." "That's what they all say," Cutter scoffed. "ID now." For a brief moment, Aniyah considered revealing her identity as police chief, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the stubborn part of her that wanted to see how far this would go. Maybe it was the fact that she knew how this officer treated people who looked like her. She wanted to confront the issue head on. "I don't need to show you my ID. I haven't done anything wrong," she replied firmly. Cutter's expression darkened. "You refusing a lawful order? That's obstruction." Aniyah felt her pulse quicken, but she stood her ground. "I know my rights." It was then that things escalated. Cutter's face twisted in anger, and before she could react, he grabbed her arm forcefully. "You think you're smart, huh? Let's see how smart you are down at the station." Aniyah felt the grip on her arm tighten as Cutter manhandled her toward his patrol car. Around them, a few onlookers began to gather, their faces etched with confusion and concern. Aniyah's heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the injustice of it all. "Let go of me," she said, her voice low but commanding. "Or what?" Cutter shot back, his tone mocking. "You gonna resist arrest?" She clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to fight back physically. Years of training had taught her restraint, but she couldn't believe this was happening. "You're making a mistake," Aniyah said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Cutter opened the back door of his patrol car and shoved her inside. It was the first time in years she'd been in the back of a police car, and it felt surreal. She could see the faces of the crowd, some taking out their phones to record the incident. A wave of humiliation washed over her, but she reminded herself that this wasn't about pride. It was about something bigger, something much more important. As the car pulled away, Aniyah stared out the window, trying to gather her thoughts. She needed to stay calm and think clearly. This wasn't the time to lose control. Cutter didn't know who she was, but he was about to find out in the most unexpected way possible. Aniyah felt the patrol car lurch forward as Officer Cutter sped away from the scene. She was trapped behind the steel grate, watching the town she had grown up in pass by, now from the back seat of a police car. The irony was overwhelming. This was the same town where she had decided to join law enforcement, inspired by a sense of duty to protect and serve, and here she was, being treated like a common criminal. As they drove, she could feel the vibrations of her phone in her pocket, no doubt buzzing with missed calls from the other officers she was supposed to meet at the local police station. She was here for an informal visit, catching up with old colleagues. Never had she imagined that she would be taken into custody before she even had a chance to say hello. Cutter's voice crackled through the police radio as he spoke with dispatch. "I've got one in custody," he said casually, as if this was routine. His arrogance was palpable. Some smart-mouthed woman causing a scene. Aniyah's jaw tightened at his tone. He had no idea who she was, yet. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that revealing her identity at the wrong moment would only make the situation worse. Timing was everything. They arrived at the station within minutes, Cutter roughly pulling her out of the car. He dragged her through the side entrance, bypassing the main lobby, likely to avoid more public scrutiny. The onlookers outside had already captured enough footage, and the last thing Cutter wanted was more eyes on this mess. He shoved her into an interrogation room, locking the door behind him. "Sit tight," he muttered, before stepping outside to talk to someone on his radio. Aniyah sat down, her hands cuffed in front of her, the cold metal biting into her wrists. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past half hour. It wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been in her position, wrongfully accused and treated like they didn't matter. Just as Aniyah was steadying herself, the door creaked open again. This time, another officer entered, but he was different, calmer, less brash. His nameplate read, Officer Henderson. He looked at her with a puzzled expression, eyes flicking between the cuffs in her face. "Ma'am, there's been some confusion," he started, but Aniyah cut him off. "There's no confusion, Officer Henderson. Your colleague doesn't know who I am." Henderson frowned. "Who are you, then?" Aniyah leaned forward slightly, her voice measured and calm. "Chief Aniyah Blackstone. I'm the police chief from Eastgate City." The weight of her words hit Henderson like a punch. He blinked rapidly, glancing down at her restrained hands in disbelief. "Wait, you're a police chief?" "That's correct," Aniyah said. "Now, I suggest you get your captain down here before this gets any worse for your department." Officer Henderson stood frozen for a moment, processing the gravity of what was happening. He stammered a quick, "Yes, ma'am," and rushed out of the room, leaving Aniyah alone again, but this time with a sense of control returning. Minutes later, the door burst open again, and this time it was Captain Lee, the head of the Brookridge precinct. His face was pale as he hurried into the room, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Aniyah in handcuffs. "Chief Blackstone, He started, but stopped himself, unsure of what to say. His hands shook slightly as he fumbled with the keys to unlock her cuffs. Aniyah stood up, rubbing her wrists once the cuffs were off, fixing Captain Lee with a sharp gaze. "You need to get your officers in line, Captain," she said coolly. "What happened today is unacceptable." I had no idea," Captain Lee stammered, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "Officer Cutter didn't realize who you were." "It shouldn't matter who I am," Aniyah snapped. "This isn't about rank or title. It's about respect and basic decency." He saw my skin color and immediately assumed the worst. Captain Lee lowered his head, shame written all over his face. "I'll handle this, Chief. Officer Cutter will be disciplined." "That's not enough," Aniyah said, her voice low and steady. "You've got a systemic problem on your hands, Captain. One bad cop is a symptom of something much deeper." Lee looked visibly shaken as the words sunk in. "You're right," he said quietly. "We have work to do." "Yes, you do," Aniyah replied firmly. "And it starts with accountability. Make sure Cutter knows the full weight of what he's done." As she walked out of the station, her head held high, Aniyah felt a deep sense of vindication, but the victory was bittersweet. She knew this wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about a system that had allowed this kind of behavior to persist for too long. Stepping out into the daylight, she noticed a crowd had gathered outside the station. Many of them had seen the arrest unfold and were now waiting for answers. As Aniyah approached, the whispers grew louder, and a few people held up their phones, recording. She paused for a moment, looking at the faces around her, some curious, some supportive, others still unsure of what to believe. Aniyah took a deep breath and turned to face them, ready to speak her truth. Aniyah stood before the crowd, her heart racing. The faces of the townspeople reflected a mix of confusion, support, and concern. She knew she had to address them, not only to clarify what had just happened, but also to shed light on the larger issues at play. "Thank you all for your patience," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I want to address what just happened inside. I was wrongfully detained by Officer Cutter, who, based on the color of my skin, assumed I was a criminal." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, while others exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. "Racial profiling is not just a personal issue, it's a systemic one," she continued. "As a law enforcement, it is our duty to protect every citizen, regardless of their background. Today, that duty was betrayed." A woman in the front, her arms crossed, spoke up. "What are you going to do about it? How can we trust the police if this is how they act?" Aniyah's gaze softened as she met the woman's eyes. "Trust is earned, and it starts with accountability. I'm going to ensure that Officer Cutter is held responsible for his actions. This incident will not be swept under the rug." The crowd started to disperse, and Aniyah could feel the weight of their expectations. As she turned to leave, a familiar voice called out from the back, "Chief Blackstone." She turned to see an old friend, Mark, stepping forward. "I'm glad you're okay. I've known you since we were kids. You always had a way of standing up for what's right." "Thank you, Mark. It's good to see you," she replied, her heart warming at the familiar face in the crowd. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us, about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I just did." As she walked away from the station, Aniyah received a call from her assistant, Jasmine. "Chief, are you okay? I saw the footage online. It's going viral." "I'm fine, Jasmine, but I need you to prepare a press release," Aniyah instructed. "We need to address this head-on and not allow the narrative to be twisted." The next day, the press conference was held at the police station, and Aniyah stood at the podium, flanked by Captain Lee and several other officers. The atmosphere was tense as reporters jostled for position, eager to get the latest scoop on the incident. "Thank you all for coming," Aniyah began, her voice clear and commanding. "I want to address the incident involving Officer Cutter and myself, which has raised serious concerns within our community." Cameras flashed as she continued. "This incident is not an isolated one. It is part of a larger pattern of racial bias within law enforcement. We are committed to rooting out these practices within our department and rebuilding the trust between the police and the community." A reporter shouted a question. "What specific actions will you take against Officer Cutter?" "He will face disciplinary action, and I will ensure that this incident is thoroughly investigated," Aniyah replied firmly. "Moreover, we will be implementing new training protocols to address racial bias and ensure that all officers are held to the highest standards of conduct." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Aniyah could see the relief on some faces. They were ready for change, and she was determined to be the catalyst. After the press conference, Aniyah returned to her office, her mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. The fight for justice was far from over, but this was a step in the right direction. As Aniyah sat on her porch, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The world around her was quiet, but her mind was alive with the sound of voices, voices of those who had shared their stories, their pain, and their hopes for a better future. She realized that the journey toward justice was not a solitary one. It was a collective effort fueled by the courage and resilience of a community yearning for change. Though the path had been fraught with challenges, Aniyah understood that every step taken was a step closer to dismantling the barriers of racial bias and inequality. With each meeting, each conversation, and each initiative, they were slowly but surely rewriting the narrative of law enforcement and restoring trust within the community. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Lee, reminding her of the upcoming community event they had planned, a celebration of unity and progress. It would be a chance for officers and residents to come together, share stories, and foster connections that would bridge the gap that had long divided them. As she stood up from her porch, Aniyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was still work to be done, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With unwavering determination, she knew she would continue to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced. Aniyah took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air wrap around her, and stepped inside her home. The fight for equality would persist, and with each passing day, she would strive to ensure that no one would ever have to endure the injustices she had faced. And so, the story of Chief Aniyah Blackstone continues, a story of resilience, hope, and the unyielding quest for justice in the face of adversity. The struggle may be ongoing, but with unity and courage, they would forge a path toward a brighter future for all.